The sound was wrong. That was the first thing that broke through the quiet of 6:42 in the morning, not the familiar lapping of the lake against the shore or the cry of a distant loon. It was a metallic clatter, a dry rattle of chain that had no business being there. I stood on my back porch, the ceramic of my coffee mug warm against my palms, and I watched her. Carol Bradshaw, newly crowned president of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association, was directing two men as they wrapped a heavy-gauge galvanized chain around the posts of my boat ramp. She was performing as she always did. Her hands were on her hips, her chin tilted up in a pantomime of righteous authority. The two men, landscapers she'd dragooned into service, looked uncomfortable. They worked with a reluctant slowness, their eyes flicking toward my house. They knew, everyone on this lake knew this was my ramp. On my property. It had been part of this property since the house was built 50 years ago. It was the entire reason my wife Eleanor had fallen in love with this place. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was a dark roast, black. I let the bitterness settle on my tongue. I didn't move from the porch. I just watched them finish. They threaded the chain through a large, ostentatious new sign that read, "Community Property. No unauthorized access. By order of the Lakeside Estates, HOA." They snapped a heavy brass padlock shut. The finality of the click carried across the damp, morning air. Carol gave the lock a satisfied tug. She turned, and for the first time, her eyes met mine. A triumphant smirk played on her lips. She strode across my lawn, which she was currently trespassing on, and stopped at the edge of the flagstone patio. "Morning, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with condescending cheerfulness. "Just getting some long-overdue safety measures in place. We've had reports of non-residents using the ramp, and it's a huge liability for the association. From now on, this area is locked. Access can be requested via a formal application to the board, for a small annual fee, of course." I said nothing. I just looked at her. I looked at the new chain, the garish sign, the brass lock glinting in the early sun. I looked at the neatly trimmed grass she was standing on, grass that my property tax bill paid for. My silence seemed to embolden her. "I have to say, Arthur, I'm surprised you didn't take this initiative yourself. It's been a free-for-all down here for years, but don't you worry. The HOA is stepping up to manage it properly now. I'll have the fine schedule for unauthorized use posted in the community newsletter. It will be steep. We can't have people thinking rules don't apply to them." She gestured vaguely at my house, at my life. I took another sip of coffee. The silence stretched. The two workmen were loading their tools back into their truck, eager to be gone. They wouldn't look at me. Finally, I lowered my mug. "Carol," I said, and my voice was quiet, even. "You are trespassing on my property. You have installed a sign and a chain on my property without my permission. You have done so in your official capacity as president of the Homeowners Association. I want to be very clear about that. Is that correct?" Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. "This is a common area, Arthur. The board has declared it so, for the safety and security of the community. Historic use dictates its status. You should read your bylaws." I nodded slowly. I raised my phone, which had been resting on the railing, and made sure she could see the screen was on. The little red dot in the corner was pulsing gently. "So for the record, you are Carol Bradshaw, president of the Lakeside Estates HOA, and you are seizing control of this boat ramp under the authority of the association." The performance was back in an instant. She puffed out her chest. "That's right, we're protecting our assets. If you have a problem with it, you can file a grievance with the board, or you can call the police, who will tell you this is a civil matter, and that the HOA has jurisdiction. Either way, that lock isn't coming off." She gave me one last withering look, turned on her heel, and marched back across my lawn to her oversized sport utility vehicle parked on the street. I watched her drive away. I looked at the chain, a scar across the landscape of my morning routine. I looked at the sign, a monument to her arrogance. I finished my coffee, the last drops now cold. She thought she was establishing a new rule. She thought she was winning a power struggle. She thought she was putting me in my place. She had no idea, she had absolutely no idea that she had just, with her own 2 hands, chained and padlocked the single, most documented, surveyed, and legally defined piece of private shoreline on this entire lake. She had no idea she had just declared war on the one man in this entire community whose entire professional life had been about the immutable truth of lines on a map. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain. This wasn't about a boat ramp. Not really, it was about order. It was about the quiet, unassailable truth of a surveyor's mark, a legal description in a deed, a line drawn in ink a half-century ago that means something. It was about the difference between what is real and what is simply asserted, loudly and repeatedly. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am 72 years old. For 45 of those years I was a licensed land surveyor. My firm, Pendleton & Son, was the premier surveying company in this county from the time my father founded it in 1955 until I sold it and retired 5 years ago. We drew the maps, we walked the lines, we drove the iron pins into the earth that said, this ends here and that begins there. Our work wasn't glamorous. It was a job of meticulous detail, of digging through dusty deed books in county courthouses, of translating the archaic language of metes and bounds into the precise geometry of a plat. It was a profession built on the bedrock of fact. You can argue with a person, but you cannot argue with a granite monument set in 1923 or the clear language of a recorded easement. The paper trail is everything. The paper trail is the final arbiter. I am, by nature, a non-confrontational man. I prefer the quiet company of my books and the familiar rhythm of my days. Eleanor, my late wife, was the vibrant one. She was the one who could charm a whole room, who loved hosting parties on the lawn that swept down to the lake. We bought this house 30 years ago for one reason, and one reason only. Lot 27 was the only parcel in the entire Lakeside Estates development that included the shoreline itself. The other lots all stopped at a vegetation line, with the waterfront designated as a conservation area owned by the original developer's trust. But Lot 27 was different. It was the original site of the developer's sales office and his personal weekend cottage. The plat map, which I personally reviewed with the obsessive focus only a surveyor can bring to such a document, was unambiguous. The property lines for Lot 27 extended a full 50 feet out into the lake bed from the mean high water mark, encompassing the small, natural cove and the simple gravel and timber ramp the developer had put in for his own boat. When we bought it, the developer's son, a quiet man who had inherited his father's practicality, shook my hand and said, "You're buying the best spot on the lake. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. That waterfront is yours." My father made sure of it. I didn't need his assurance. I had the map. I had the deed. I had the title insurance. On paper, my ownership was an ironclad, demonstrable fact. For 30 years it was. Neighbors would occasionally ask to use the ramp to launch a canoe or a small fishing boat, and I, and later Eleanor, always said yes. We were neighbors. It was the decent thing to do. We never asked for money. It was a kindness, not a public utility. Then came Carol Bradshaw. She and her husband bought the house across the street 3 years ago. She was a whirlwind of manicured energy and pronouncements. Within 6 months, she had launched a campaign to revitalize the HOA, which had previously been a sleepy, informal entity mainly concerned with road maintenance and a yearly picnic. She ran for president on a platform of protecting our property values and enforcing community standards. She won, mostly because no one else wanted the job, and then the letters started. Little slips of pastel-colored paper left in mailboxes. Mr. Henderson, 2 doors down, was fined $25 for unapproved garden ornamentation, a collection of cheerful ceramic gnomes his late wife had adored. The Miller family was fined $50 for having a basketball hoop that was not the approved shade of forest green. I received a notice that the trim on my house, a soft dove gray, that Eleanor had picked out was not on the pre-approved color palette. The fine was $100. I looked at the notice. I looked at the picture of my house with an aggressive red circle drawn around the trim. I thought about arguing. I could have pulled the original development covenants, which had no such color restrictions. I could have pointed out that my house predated the revitalized HOA's new rules by decades. I could have raised a fuss, but I was tired. Eleanor had been gone for 2 years and the fight had gone out of me. It was easier to just pay. So I wrote a check for $100. I made a copy of the check. I made a copy of the fine notice. I put them both in a simple manila folder, the kind I had used for 45 years to organize survey jobs. On the tab, I wrote in my neat, blocky architect's script, Carol Bradshaw, HOA. Over the next year, the folder grew thicker. A $75 fine for my mailbox being 2 inches too close to the road. A claim easily disproven by the Postal Service regulations, I printed out and filed alongside the receipt for my payment. A $50 fine for visible refuse containers, issued on a Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., an hour after the garbage truck had come and before I had a chance to bring the empty bins in. I paid it. I kept the receipts. I documented everything. It was second nature. It was what I did. I was building a file, though I didn't know what for. It felt like a surveyor's habit. You collect all the data first. You don't draw conclusions until you have every point plotted. The boat ramp became her obsession about 6 months ago. She started referring to it as the community ramp in her increasingly strident monthly newsletters. She wrote about the unregulated activity and the potential for accidents. She was building a narrative brick by brick out of pure fiction. Her fiction was that the ramp was a common area that had been neglected. The truth, that it was private property whose owner had been generous, was an inconvenient fact she simply chose to ignore. She had no interest in the truth. The truth didn't give her power. This was the history that led to the chain and the padlock. This was the context for her smug, triumphant smile as she drove away from my house. She saw me as a quiet old man, a pushover who paid his fines and kept to himself. She saw the ramp as an asset to be seized, a symbol of her authority. She had no idea that her every action, her every pastel-colored notice, her every puffed-up proclamation had been noted, copied, and filed. She had no idea that in my office, in a simple manila folder, was a meticulous record of her tyranny. She had no idea that I kept the receipts. After she left, I went back inside. I rinsed out my coffee mug and placed it in the dishwasher. I walked into my home office, the room that used to be my son's bedroom. The walls are lined with maps, old nautical charts, topographical surveys of the national parks, and a framed copy of the very first plat my father ever certified. I sat down at my large oak desk. It was clear of clutter. Everything had its place. I pulled the Carol Bradshaw HOA folder from my filing cabinet. It was now almost 2 inches thick. I placed it squarely in the center of my desk. Then I got to work. My first step was not to grab a pair of bolt cutters. That would be her move. That would be an act of emotion, of escalation, that would play directly into her narrative. She wanted a fight. She wanted a shouting match on the lawn. She wanted me to look like the unreasonable one. I would not give her that satisfaction. My response would be quiet, methodical, and overwhelming. It would be a response built not of anger, but of paper. I drafted a letter. It was more formal than the first one I'd contemplated sending, about the house paint. I used the precise, dispassionate language of a legal document. The letter was addressed to Carol Bradshaw in her official capacity as president of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association and to the board of directors. It began, "This letter serves as a formal notice of trespass and a demand to cease and desist." I cited the parcel number of my property, the book and page number where my deed was recorded at the county courthouse, and the specific language in the deed that described the property boundaries extending into the lake. I stated, clearly and without embellishment, that the boat ramp, the shoreline, and the land upon which they had installed their sign and chain were, and always had been, my private property. I then detailed their transgressions: the unauthorized entry onto my land, the installation of a physical barrier restricting my access to my own property, and the public declaration of my private land as a common area. I informed them that they had 72 hours from receipt of the letter to remove the chain, the lock, and the sign, and to issue a public retraction in the next community newsletter. I stated that failure to comply would result in legal action, for which I would seek not only the removal of the barrier, but also damages for slander of title, trespass, and all associated legal fees. I printed 2 copies. One I would send via certified mail, with a signature required, to the official address of the HOA. This created an undeniable record of receipt. The other copy I would hand-deliver. Before I sealed the envelope for the certified letter, I included a high-quality copy of the recorded plat map from the county's public records, with my property, Lot 27, highlighted in yellow. The lines were clear, the dimensions noted. It was a simple, brutal fact. I drove to the post office and sent the certified letter. Then I drove to Carol's house. Her SUV was in the driveway. I walked up her perfectly manicured walkway and rang the doorbell. She opened the door, a look of surprise flashing across her face, quickly replaced by a guarded scowl. "Arthur," she said, her voice flat. "What do you want?" I held out the envelope. "This is a copy of a letter I have just sent to the HOA's official address via certified mail. I wanted to ensure you received it personally, and without delay." She snatched the envelope from my hand. She didn't open it. "Grievances are to be submitted to the board for review," she said, reciting her procedural nonsense. "There's a process." "This is not a grievance, Carol," I said, my voice still quiet. "It is a legal notice. I suggest you and the board review it with your attorney. You have 72 hours. I turned and walked away. I heard the sound of paper tearing behind me. I didn't look back. I knew she would tear it up. It was part of her performance, an act of defiance for an audience of one. It didn't matter. The certified letter was already in the mail system. The clock was ticking. Her tearing up the letter was just another piece of data. Spoliation of evidence, a lawyer might call it. I simply called it predictable. The 72 hours passed in silence. The chain remained. The sign remained. On the community Facebook group, which I monitored through a dummy account, she posted a cheerful message. "So wonderful to see our community assets being protected. Safety first." A few of her sycophants posted clapping emojis. Mr. Henderson, I noted, was not among them. The morning the deadline expired, I walked down to the ramp. Nothing had changed. I took a picture with my phone, the date and timestamp clearly visible. Then I went back to my desk. The time for warnings was over. The time for preparation had begun. I called David. David Martinez had been my protege at the firm. A brilliant young man with a mind for geographic information systems, GIS, and a deep respect for the old ways of surveying. He'd taken over a lot of my big projects before I retired. "Arthur," he said, his voice warm. "How's retirement? Finally getting that boat in the water?" "Not at the moment, David," I said. "The ramp is blockaded. I have an HOA problem." There was a moment of silence, then a low whistle. "Oh no, not the infamous Carol Bradshaw. My parents live over in Silver Creek, and they've heard stories." "The very same," I said. "I need to build a case file, an unassailable one. I need to pull every document related to the Lakeside Estates development. Original plats, all revisions, county zoning approvals, meeting minutes from the Planning Commission back in the 60s. Everything. I also need you to build me a full GIS overlay, tax map, zoning map in the original plat, all layered on top of a current aerial photograph. I want to show the chain of title and the physical reality in one simple image. Consider it done, boss," he said, the old nickname slipping out. "You want the full Pendleton treatment? Then, The one we used on that big commercial dispute downtown? The full treatment, I confirmed. I want to bury her in documented, verifiable facts. I'll pay our standard commercial rate. Don't you dare, Arthur, he said, his voice firm. This one is on the house for Eleanor. She was always so kind to me. Just tell me what you need. For the next week, my office became a command center. David's digital files poured into my inbox. I printed them, organized them, and cross-referenced them. The GIS overlay was a thing of beauty, a digital tapestry of legal reality. The lines were perfect. My property, Lot 27, was a clear, solid block of color that extended from the road to 50 feet past the shoreline, a bright, unambiguous declaration of ownership. The other lots stopped short, exactly as I remembered. But as I dug deeper, I felt a familiar surveyor's itch. Something was missing. The current HOA documents, the ones Carol was always quoting, were thin. They were a simplified, retyped version of the original covenants, filed in the early 2000s by a previous, well-meaning but sloppy board. Key details were omitted. I knew there had to be more. The developer, a man named William Abernathy, had been a stickler for detail. Much like my own father, he would have left a more robust paper trail. That's when I decided to go to the county records vault. Not the public-facing counter with its digitized, often incomplete records, but the deep archive, the climate-controlled room in the basement where they keep the original vellum and linen plat maps. The ones too large or too fragile to be scanned. I still had friends down there. A phone call to the county clerk, a woman I'd worked with for 30 years, got me access. The air in the vault was cool and smelled of old paper and dust. I spent hours carefully unrolling the original master plot for Lakeside Estates, filed in 1962. It was a massive sheet of vellum, nearly 4 feet wide. The ink was faded, but still crisp. And there, in the bottom right corner, in a block of text labeled Covenants and Restrictions, I found it. The bombshell. It was a handwritten addendum initialed by William Abernathy himself and the county planning director at the time. It had never been transcribed into the later digitized versions of the covenants. It was, for all practical purposes, a forgotten clause. The clause stated, in Abernathy's elegant cursive, the shoreline and lakebed access, appurtenant to Lot 27, shall remain the private, exclusive, and unencumbered property of the grantee and their heirs, and assigns in perpetuity. Said shoreline includes a subterranean drainage culverement running from the roadway to the lake, essential for the proper drainage of the western portion of the development. Any obstruction of Lot 27's shoreline or the underlying drainage easement is expressly forbidden. I stood there in the silent, cold vault and read it 3 times. A drainage easement. An essential one. By putting a chain and concrete footers for the signposts across the front of my ramp, she hadn't just trespassed. She had potentially obstructed a critical piece of infrastructure for the entire neighborhood. She had no idea. She had no idea she had just buried the only thing keeping half the street from flooding during a heavy rain. But that wasn't the biggest discovery. As my eyes scanned the surveyor's block at the bottom of the map, my breath caught in my chest. The crisp, familiar signature of the certifying surveyor. The man who had walked this land, driven the stakes, and drawn these very lines. The man whose work created the legal reality Carol was trying to erase. It was my father. I gently rolled the vellum back up. I had the clerk make a certified high-resolution scan of the entire document, paying special attention to the handwritten addendum and my father's signature block. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, holding the tube containing the certified copy like it was a sacred text. This was no longer just a dispute about property. It was about my father's legacy. It was about the work of his hands and the integrity of his name. Carol Bradshaw wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was fighting my family's history and the unyielding truth of the lines we had drawn. The folder on my desk was about to get its capstone document. The escalation I was waiting for came 3 days later. It was a Saturday morning. I was weeding the flower bed by the front walk, a task Eleanor had always enjoyed, and which I now found meditative. I saw Carol's car pull up, followed by a sheriff's department cruiser. She got out of her car, her face a mask of theatrical distress. She pointed a trembling finger at me. Deputy Miller, a young man with a calm, professional demeanor, got out of his cruiser and walked toward me. "Sir, I'm Deputy Miller," he said, his hand resting near his sidearm, a standard posture. "We received a call about a resident attempting to destroy HOA property." Carol scurried over to his side. "He's been threatening to cut the lock, officer," she said, her voice high and strained. "He's been harassing me. This ramp is community property, and he thinks he can just do whatever he wants. He's a menace." I slowly got to my feet, brushing the dirt from my knees. I looked at Deputy Miller, ignoring Carol completely. "Good morning, Deputy," I said calmly. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I live here." "Sir, can you tell me what's going on?" he asked, his eyes scanning the scene, me in my gardening clothes, the quiet street, and Carol, who was practically vibrating with indignation. "Certainly," I said. "That woman," I gestured with my chin toward Carol, "is Carol Bradshaw, the president of our local homeowners association. A few days ago she and two men came onto my private property and installed that chain, lock, and singing on my boat ramp without my consent." Carol sputtered. "It's not your property. It's a common area. I have the bylaws." Deputy Miller held up a hand to quiet her. He looked back at me. "Mr. Pendleton, Mrs. Bradshaw asserts this is HOA property. Do you have anything to indicate otherwise?" This was the moment, the one I had prepared for. It was a public test with an officer of the law as a witness. This was no longer a private dispute, and it was now a matter of public record. "I do," I said, "if you'll give me one moment." I walked into my house. I returned not with my thick folder of evidence. That would be overkill, a sign of emotional investment. I returned with two documents. The first was my driver's license, which I handed to the deputy. The second was a single, folded sheet of paper. "My license confirms I reside at this address, which is Lot 27, I explained. "This second document is a certified copy of the first page of the recorded deed for this property. You can see the legal description right here." I pointed to the paragraph. It clearly states the property boundaries. "Mrs. Bradshaw is currently standing on my land. Her sign and chain are on my land. The boat ramp is on my land." Deputy Miller took the deed and read it. He was a careful reader. His eyes went over the legal description. Then he looked up, past the lawn, toward the lake. He was mentally plotting the lines. He understood. He turned to Carol. "Ma'am, this document appears to show that the property in question does, in fact, belong to Mr. Pendleton." Carol's face went pale, then flushed with red. "That's just some old piece of paper. The HOA bylaws supersede that. We have jurisdiction over all common areas, and historic use makes that a common area." The deputy's expression didn't change, but I saw a subtle shift in his posture. A slight weariness. He had seen this kind of performance before. "Ma'am, a recorded deed is a legal document filed with the county. HOA bylaws can't unilaterally seize a person's private property," he said, his voice patient but firm. "This appears to be a civil matter." "So you're not going to do anything?" she shrieked. "He's going to cut the lock," I spoke again, my voice still level. "Deputy, for the record, I have no intention of cutting the lock. I intend to resolve this matter through the proper legal channels. I would, however, like to formally state for your report that Mrs. Bradshaw is trespassing on my property at this moment. I am not pressing charges at this time, but I want her presence here, and her claims, officially noted." Deputy Miller looked at me. He saw my calm demeanor. He saw my simple, powerful evidence. He looked at Carol, who was now fuming, her performance of victimhood collapsing into pure rage. He nodded slowly. "I understand, sir," he said. He turned to Carol. "Ma'am, as this is a civil dispute over property lines, there is no law enforcement action to be taken. I would advise you to leave Mr. Pendleton's property and consult an attorney." He handed the deed back to me. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, and in them I saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even a hint of respect. He knew who was telling the truth. His body camera had recorded the entire exchange. My calm, factual statements, and Carol's hysterical, baseless accusations. He had just, unwittingly, become my best witness. Carol stared at him, aghast. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a venomous fury. She had called the authorities to bend me to her will, and they had politely told her she was in the wrong. She had lost control of the narrative. Without a word, she stomped back to her car and sped away, tires squealing in protest. Deputy Miller gave me a slight nod. "Have a good day, Mr. Pendleton." "You too, Deputy," I said. I went back to my gardening. But the ground felt different now. Firmer. The line had been drawn not just on a map, but in the presence of the law. The encounter had been a small skirmish, but it was a decisive one. It had moved the conflict out of the realm of neighborhood gossip and into the world of official reports and documented evidence. And it had sent a signal. The signal was received. The next evening my doorbell rang. It was Mr. Henderson, my neighbor from 2 doors down. He was a frail man in his 80s, and he was clutching a worn shoe box to his chest, as if it contained state secrets. "Arthur," he said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper, "I saw what happened with the sheriff's deputy. Good for you. Good for you for standing up to her." "Come in, George," I said, holding the door open. He sat stiffly on the edge of my armchair, the shoe box on his lap. "She's been after me for years, you know. The gnomes, the length of my grass, the bird feeder, fines, always fines. I just paid them. It was easier. My heart's not so good. But what she's doing to you, that's different. That's theft." He opened the shoe box. Inside, nestled amongst old photographs and medals from his time in the Army, were a half-dozen cassette tapes. "I used to be the HOA secretary," he explained, "back before it got nasty. I recorded all the meetings, just for my minutes. I found this." He pulled out a single cassette, labeled with a piece of masking tape. "Annual meeting, June 1998. The developer's son, Mr. Abernathy Jr., was there," George said, his eyes bright with memory. "Someone asked about the shoreline, about who was responsible for its upkeep. I remember it clear as day." He tapped the cassette. "His answer is on here. I thought maybe it could help." My heart beat a little faster. This was a piece of history I didn't have, a first-hand account. "George, this is incredible," I said. "Thank you. This is more helpful than you can imagine." He looked relieved. "I was afraid to come forward. She can be so vindictive, but then I saw you, so calm. You weren't afraid. It made me feel a bit braver." After he left, I found an old cassette player in the back of a closet. I sat at my desk and pressed play. The audio was tinny, full of hiss and the sound of chairs scraping. Then, a voice I recognized as a younger George Henderson said, "Question for Mr. Abernathy?" And then another voice, clear and patrician, the voice of the developer's son, came through the small speaker. "Yes, the shoreline," the voice said. "Let me be clear for the record. The vast majority of the waterfront is a conservation buffer, owned by my family's trust. The HOA has no ownership and no jurisdiction. The only exception is Lot 27. My father kept that lot for himself, and he made sure the deed included the shoreline and the ramp. That belongs to the Pendletons now. It is private property, full stop. We were all happy when they bought it, because we knew they would be good stewards. So to be clear, the HOA has no business, no rights, and no responsibilities regarding any part of the shoreline, especially not the Pendletons' ramp." I hit stop. I sat back in my chair, the hum of the tape player filling the silence. It was a direct, unambiguous statement from the one person who could speak for the developer's original intent. It corroborated my deed, my plat map, and my father's work. I had the paper, and now I had the voice. The case was becoming a fortress. The coalition began to form quietly. 2 days after George's visit, I received an anonymous email. It was from a generic, throwaway address. The subject line was simply HOA. The body of the email was short. I am on the board. I can no longer stand by and watch what she is doing. She is acting unilaterally. The attached documents show she hired a lawyer with HOA funds for a consultation last month. The lawyer's written opinion, which she never shared with the full board, is that the HOA has absolutely no claim to your property. She is proceeding against legal advice. She also paid for the gate and sign without a board vote, classifying it as emergency maintenance. This is fraud. Attached were 2 PDF files. The first was an invoice and a letter from a local law firm. The letter was exactly as described. A blunt, professional opinion that the HOA's position was legally indefensible. The second was a detailed ledger from the HOA's accounts, with the payment to the gate company and the law firm highlighted. The sender, whom I suspected was the treasurer, Brenda, a quiet accountant who always looked exhausted at the annual meetings, had just handed me evidence of Carol's bad faith and potential misuse of funds. She wasn't just wrong, she was knowingly, maliciously wrong. She had been told by her own lawyer that she would lose, and she had pressed forward anyway, using our money to do it. I added the documents to my file. I sent a copy of the cassette tape to a professional transcription service to have a certified transcript made. The pieces were all falling into place. The factual basis of my case was now unassailable. I had the deed, the original plat map with the forgotten covenant, the testimony of the developer's son, an eyewitness account from a former board member, the official report from a sheriff's deputy, and now, internal HOA documents proving malice and financial misconduct. Carol, oblivious to the fortress of evidence being built against her, made one final, spectacular miscalculation. It was the act of a tyrant who feels her power slipping and decides that what is needed is not cunning, but a bigger hammer. A week before the scheduled annual HOA meeting, a process server came to my door. He handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a formal notice from the Lakeside Estates HOA. It informed me that, due to my continued defiance of community standards and attempted unauthorized modification of a common area, I was being fined $10,000. Furthermore, the HOA was placing a lien on my property for that amount. I read the document, and for the first time in this whole affair, I almost laughed. It was such a perfect, self-destructive act of hubris. A lien. She was trying to cloud the title of my property, the one thing a surveyor holds sacred. It was a declaration of total war, and she had just armed me with her most powerful weapon against herself. Filing a fraudulent lien is a serious offense. It's called slander of title, and the penalties are severe. I took the notice with its flimsy legal reasoning and astronomical fine and placed it right on top of my file. It was the capstone. It was the final, desperate lunge of a cornered animal. The annual meeting was in 7 days. It was time to put an end to this. I called my lawyer, not the kind of lawyer who writes threatening letters. I called the kind of lawyer who goes to court and doesn't lose. The annual HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile, beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine from the adjacent indoor pool. The air was thick with a tense, artificial cordiality. The room was packed, more so than any meeting I'd ever attended. On one side sat Carol's contingent, a handful of board members who owed their positions to her, and a few residents who enjoyed her brand of authoritarianism. They chatted amongst themselves, confident and smug. On the other side, scattered throughout the room, were the others. Mr. Henderson sat near the front, looking pale but determined. Brenda, the treasurer, sat ramrod straight, her purse clutched in her lap. The Miller family was there, and a dozen other homeowners I recognized. People who had been on the receiving end of Carol's pastel-colored fines. They were quiet, anxious, watching me. I gave them a small, reassuring nod. I was not alone. I was simply the tip of the spear. I sat in the front row with my lawyer, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman named Sarah Jennings. She had a reputation for being a shark in the courtroom, but in person, She was all calm, quiet efficiency. In front of her on the table was not my sprawling folder, but a single, slim, black binder. It was organized with numbered tabs. Sarah believed in the theater of revelation. You don't dump the whole story at once. You dismantle your opponent piece by methodical piece. The meeting began with banal formalities. Minutes from the last meeting, the treasurer's report, which Brenda read in a clipped, neutral tone, betraying nothing. Then, Carol, as president, stood up to give her annual address. This was her moment, her stage. She began with a folksy charm, thanking everyone for coming. She talked about community, about shared values, about protecting their investment. Then, her tone shifted. Her voice took on a somber, wounded quality. She spoke of challenges to the community's integrity. As many of you know, she said, her eyes sweeping the room, landing on me with a flicker of pity. We have had to take firm action recently to secure a vital community asset. She gestured vaguely in the direction of the lake. Our community boat ramp, which has been used by all of us for years, was falling into a state of disrepair and unregulated use, posing a tremendous safety and liability risk to every single homeowner in this association. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. One of our residents, she continued, her voice now trembling slightly, a masterful performance of reluctant duty, has unfortunately decided to claim this shared space as his own. He has refused to cooperate. He has been hostile. He has threatened our community's well-being for his own selfish gain. We on the board have been patient. We have tried to reason with him, but our primary duty is to you, the community. That is why with a heavy heart we were forced to secure the ramp and, when faced with continued defiance, to issue a significant fine and place a lien on the property to protect the association's interests. She looked like she was about to cry. This is not what any of us wanted, but we cannot allow one person to endanger the safety and financial stability of our entire neighborhood. We must stand together. We must uphold the rules. She sat down to a smattering of applause from her section. A few people on my side of the room shifted uncomfortably. Her narrative was powerful, emotional. It painted me as a stubborn, selfish old man, and her as the reluctant, duty-bound protector of the people. It was a complete fabrication, but it was a compelling one. The agenda moved to new business. Sarah Jennings stood up. "Madam President," she said, her voice clear and cutting through the murmuring. "Sarah Jennings, counsel for Mr. Arthur Pendleton. My client would like to address the issue of the boat ramp and the lien you have just discussed." Carol's eyes narrowed. She had not expected me to bring a lawyer. "This is a community meeting, not a courtroom," she snapped. "Grievances must be submitted in writing." "This is not a grievance," Sarah said smoothly. "It is a public response to the public accusations you have just made, and a presentation of facts relevant to the lien placed on my client's property. I believe the homeowners here deserve to have all the information." Before Carol could object further, a board member, a man named Tom, who looked tired of the whole thing, spoke up. "Let her speak, Carol. It's only fair." Carol shot him a look of pure venom, but reluctantly nodded. 5 minutes. Sarah smiled faintly. "I'll be brief." She walked to the front of the room, holding the black binder. "Mrs. Bradshaw has made several claims. I would like to address them with documented facts." She opened the binder. First, the claim that the boat ramp is a community asset, or common area. "Here," she said, pulling out a document and placing it on the overhead projector, "is a certified copy of the recorded deed for Lot 27, the property owned by my client, Mr. Pendleton. The legal description clearly includes the land on which the ramp is situated. It is, and always has been, private property." A murmur went through the room. "Second," Sarah continued, unflustered, "the claim of historic use creating a public right. Here is a certified transcript of an audio recording from the 1998 annual HOA meeting." She placed a new sheet on the projector. In it, the developer's son, William Abernathy Jr., states for the record, and I quote, "The only exception is Lot 27. That belongs to the Pendletons now. It is private property, full stop. The HOA has no business, no rights, and no responsibilities regarding any part of the shoreline, especially not the Pendletons' ramp." The man who provided this recording, former HOA Secretary George Henderson, is in this room today. All eyes turned to Mr. Henderson. He sat up a little straighter. The murmur grew louder. Carol's face was tightening. "Third," Sarah said, her voice like ice. "The claim that the board acted patiently and in good faith. Here is a copy of a letter from the law firm of Smith & Carlisle, dated 6 weeks ago, and addressed to Mrs. Bradshaw. This letter, paid for with HOA funds, explicitly advises Mrs. Bradshaw that the HOA has no legal claim to Mr. Pendleton's property, and that any attempt to restrict his access would be unlawful." Mrs. Bradshaw concealed this legal opinion from the rest of the board and proceeded anyway. Brenda, the treasurer, gasped theatrically. "She told us the lawyer said we had a strong case." The room erupted. Carol was on her feet. "That's a privileged document. That's out of order." "It's evidence of malfeasance and misuse of HOA funds, which makes it very much in order," Sarah replied without missing a beat. "It shows you were not acting with a heavy heart, Mrs. Bradshaw. You were acting with full knowledge that your actions were illegal." The collapse began there. It was in her eyes. The confident, righteous fury was gone, replaced by a flat, dead panic. The mask was slipping. She looked around the room, but her supporters were no longer looking at her. They were looking at the documents on the screen. They were looking at each other, but Sarah wasn't finished. This was the moment for the final, crushing blow. "And finally," she said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in, "there is the matter of the original development plan for Lakeside Estates." She removed all the papers from the projector and replaced them with a single, large, high-resolution image. It was the scan of the old vellum map. "This is the original certified plat map for this entire development, filed in 1962, Sarah announced. "It is the foundational legal document for every property in this room. I'd like to draw your attention to this handwritten covenant, which was somehow omitted from the simplified bylaws you operate under today." She used a laser pointer to circle the elegant cursive. It reads, "The shoreline and lakebed access appurtenant to Lot 27 shall remain the private, exclusive, and unencumbered property of the grantee, in perpetuity." It goes on to note a critical detail. Said shoreline includes a subterranean drainage culvert easement, essential for the proper drainage of the western portion of the development. Any obstruction of Lot 27's shoreline, or the underlying drainage easement, is expressly forbidden. Sarah paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Mrs. Bradshaw, when you ordered your men to install the posts for your sign, they dug into the ground directly over that 50-year-old easement. Your chain and your sign are not just a trespass against my client. They are a potential threat to the property of every person on the west side of this street. You have obstructed critical infrastructure in your personal quest for control." The room was dead silent. You could hear the hum of the projector fan. Carol Bradshaw stood frozen, her face a blank canvas of shock. Her performance had ended. The reality in crisp, undeniable black and white had replaced it. Sarah had one last thing to add. She aimed the laser pointer at the bottom of the map, at the surveyor's certification block. "As a final point of interest," she said softly, "the surveyor who drew this map, who guaranteed the integrity of these lines and the function of that easement, the man whose work is the very legal foundation of this community, was Howard Pendleton. My client's father. That was it, the final perfect crushing weight. The story was complete. It wasn't just my property. It was my father's promise. Written in ink on the map of their world. Dear." Carol sank back into her chair. She didn't speak. She just stared at the screen, at my father's signature. She had picked a fight with a quiet old man, and had ended up at war with history itself. She had no idea. She never stood a chance. The room remained silent for a long moment, the truth of it all settling like dust. Then, Tom, the board member, cleared his throat and said, I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in our president. Someone else seconded it instantly. The spell was broken. The reign was over. The verdict, when it came, was not a single event, but a cascade of them. The vote of no confidence in Carol was nearly unanimous. She resigned from the board on the spot, stuffing her papers into a briefcase with trembling hands and leaving the clubhouse without another word. The remaining board members, led by Tom and a visibly relieved Brenda, immediately voted to rescind the fine and formally withdraw the lien against my property. They offered a profound and public apology to me. The chain and sign were removed from my boat ramp by Tom and Mr. Henderson themselves, less than an hour later, a small, symbolic act of restoration. But my lawyer and I were not finished. The public humiliation was only the beginning of Carol's consequences. The following week, Sarah filed a civil lawsuit against Carol Bradshaw personally, not against the HOA. We sued for slander of title due to the fraudulent lien, trespass, and sought full restitution for all my legal fees, the cost of David's GIS work, the transcription service, and punitive damages for her malicious and willful misconduct. Her own words and actions were the primary evidence against her. The body cam footage from Deputy Miller's visit showed her belligerence and false claims. The letter from her own lawyer proved she acted in bad faith. Brenda's documents proved she misused HOA funds to pursue a personal vendetta. The judge, a stern woman who had little patience for bullies, granted us a summary judgment. There was no trial. The evidence was too overwhelming. Carol was ordered to pay every penny of my expenses, plus an additional $50,000 in punitive damages. The financial blow was devastating for her. The judgment, a public record, shattered her reputation in the community. Within 6 months, a "for sale" sign went up in front of her house. She and her husband had to sell to cover the legal judgment and their own lawyers' fees. I heard they moved out of state. I never saw her again. The healing in the community was slow, but steady. Brenda was elected the new HOA president. Her first act was to call a special meeting to overhaul the bylaws, all of Carol's petty vindictive rules, the mailbox regulations, the garden gnome prohibitions, the approved color palettes, were struck. They went back to the original, simpler covenants, the ones focused on the basics of road maintenance and shared spaces. Brenda also commissioned a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances during Carol's tenure. It uncovered more misuse of funds, which the board chose to handle internally by strengthening their financial controls, wanting to put the whole, ugly chapter behind them. The fines Carol had levied against residents like Mr. Henderson were all refunded, with interest. It was a small gesture, but a powerful one. It was an admission that the system had been used to punish, not to protect. People started talking to each other again. The atmosphere of suspicion lifted. Mr. Henderson's gnomes reappeared in his garden, more numerous and cheerful than ever. The Miller family's son played basketball in the driveway without fear of a citation. A quiet, neighborly peace returned. I became something of a reluctant local hero. People would wave as they walked past my house. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years stopped by to thank me. They didn't thank me for getting my boat ramp back. They thanked me for standing up, for showing them that one person, armed with quiet facts, could dismantle a bully's entire reality. I would just nod and thank them. I never wanted the attention. I only wanted the order restored. One afternoon, a few months after the meeting, Mr. Henderson came by with a small, wrapped gift. It was a framed, high-quality photograph of the lake at sunrise, taken from the end of my boat ramp. "Thought you should have this," he said. "A reminder of what you were fighting for." I hung it in my office, next to the framed plat map my father had signed. They looked good together. The promise and the thing it promised. Now my mornings are quiet again. The only sound is the lapping of the water and the cry of the loons. I sit on my back porch with my coffee, and I look at the unobstructed view of the lake. The ramp is there, simple and useful. Sometimes a neighbor will call and ask if their kids can launch a kayak from it. I always say yes. It is a kindness, freely given, not a right to be seized. I still have the folder. Carol Bradshaw, HOA. It sits in my filing cabinet, a thick testament to a battle I never sought, but was uniquely prepared to fight. I kept the receipts, every last one. They are a monument to the simple, powerful idea that truth is not a matter of opinion or volume, but of documentation. In the end, it was never about the ramp. It was about the lines. The lines my father drew on a map. The lines in my deed. The line between right and wrong. Between what is yours and what is not. Carol Bradshaw tried to erase those lines and draw her own. She believed that power came from performance, from assertion, from bending reality to her will. She learned that true power, the kind that endures, lies in the quiet, unyielding authority of a recorded fact. It lies in the paper trail. Ownership, I've come to realize, is not just about a piece of paper. It is a responsibility. It is a form of stewardship. Eleanor and I were stewards of this small piece of the world. I fought to honor that stewardship, to preserve the quiet order she loved. And now, the order is restored. The water is calm. The line holds. And there is peace.